All right, thank you. First, I'd like to thank Serge and Esther and all the rest of the group here for the opportunity to speak with you. I have to say that Serge is one of the people that is most challenging to my thinking from a traditional university framework. And I find that particularly important in the emphasis on trust and the relationships involved. So it's really an honor to share this opportunity to be here with you. I think it's helpful to give you just a brief vignette of who I am so you know where I'm coming from, because I'm pretty traditional in the background that I represent. So who's speaking to you? So this is my life in logos, starting as a banana slug at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and then moving through graduate school and postdoc work and a couple of sidebar private consulting relationships with AT&T and such. Spent 8 years at a medical school and eventually ended up through MIT down to Queensland and finally back at the University of Texas at Austin. So in some sense, I feel that I've kind of followed the millennial pattern, but not in the way I've approached getting my degree, but in fact in the sense that I think Dave from IBM would said that the average post at an institution or a working position now is 4.4 years, and that's probably true of me as well. The longest place I've ever worked is about 8 years. And part of it I used to think was just professional ADD, but perhaps not. It's also useful that I am involved in a number of organizations, the NMC, EDUCAUSE, ABLE with Tracy, IMS Global, and the Society for Learning Analytics and Research. So that's kind of the framework that I have as a lens to view things. I'm also mindful that we're here in Bologna, which is a unique place in the history of Western university thought. More importantly, they're one of the first to offer this thing called a degree, here an electrical engineering degree that's being offered to the individual that's listed. And what's particularly interesting is that this location was the home of the beginnings of the Western view of higher education. And students from all over Europe traveled to Bologna to find a professor and spend time with them in the mid-11th century. One of the problems they encountered was something called the law of reprisals of that period. This was back when city-states were the primary order of governance. And in the law of reprisals, if you went through a town, that magistrate could arrest you and incarcerate you and do all kinds of mean, nasty things to you because you may have come from a town that somebody else had passed through from that town and owed them. And so you were responsible for any of the debts or any of the violations associated with anybody from whom that town previously had passed if they hadn't made up for those. And that was actually a major issue. Property could be seized, all kinds of things. The emperor at the time was Frederick Barbarossa, and he recognized this as an issue. And in the Diet of Roncagli in November 1158, he actually issued something called the Privilegium Scholasticum, or also known as the Authentica Habita. It guaranteed safe passage to students coming to or residing at the university for the purposes of study. And it also did the same for faculty or academics. Now this was under the imprimatur of the emperor, so if someone violated that, they would in fact be fined. If they were a magistrate, they would lose their position, and so it was actually reasonably well followed. The reason he gave for doing this is he said the whole world is illuminated by the student's learning. One cannot help feel compassion for those who love learning and choose, now faculty will appreciate this, who choose exile and poverty and love of learning, and divest themselves of patrimony, while exposing themselves to every peril, suffering what must be grievous and enduring bodily injury caused by the vilest of men, the magistrates. So that's the context within which we sit, and I thought that was worth noting because it certainly often feels that way in current faculty environments at our university. So universities have the unique role, and I would argue perhaps the solely unique role, of granting post-secondary qualifications. Indeed, if other institutions begin to assume that role, the stability, the longevity, the future of the institution as we know it would be, I think, in deep jeopardy. So, let me give you a brief introduction to the institution I'm from, which is University of Texas at Austin. It's a single campus. It's part of a system, but it is a single campus. In U.S. terms, it's old, 1883. There are 18 colleges or schools in it, and the most important thing to note is that it's reasonably large. We have about, I would say, 51,000 students on average. First-year class is about 8,700 students, and it's mostly mixed with a few more women than men. More importantly, from this perspective, is that it is incredibly diverse. There are over 170 different programs, 223 graduate programs. It is hugely diverse, with lots of libraries, 17 of them, 7 museums, etc., all on about 174 hectares. And it's hemmed into the city of Austin on all sides, so there's nowhere to grow but either online or up. And that's the two choices we have. So we are a big, conservative, in U.S. terms, land-grant institution. A land-grant institution is something that was decreed in the 1860s with an act called the Morrill Act, which designated places all over the country and every state for higher education research, and at the time largely to facilitate the distribution of practical knowledge in the agricultural space to those particular regions. We also suffer from an ungodly amount of oversight. We have an institutional leadership, we have a system chancellor, we have a board of regents, we have something called the Texas Coordinating Board, and we have the legislature, all of which believe that they have rights to be able to designate or suggest and enforce policies at the institutional level. Now, let me switch to a story to motivate the rest of this talk. A colleague staff member of mine, while he was growing up, wanted to be a musician. He's perhaps now represents the transition from the baby boomer to the millennial status, but his story started with music. Cooper is his name, went to initially New York University as a freshman from a small town in Oklahoma, and then found that perhaps New York was a bit too overpowering, and he ended up dropping out, moving to California, going to University of California, Santa Barbara. That was nice, but probably the beach was too attractive, and so he dropped out of there. He moved up to San Francisco because San Francisco had a lot of attraction back then, as it does now, and went to San Francisco State. Didn't quite stay long enough to get through that, and moved further north to Arcata, California, went to Humboldt State, and eventually finished there. That took him 11 years as an undergraduate. After that, he went to Austin to pursue his music, ended up going to graduate school at the University of Texas, and ended up with a PhD in philosophy. Now he's a systems programmer. So that's a trajectory that, in fact, is more common than not in the U.S. culture. And one of the results of that is a pile of transcripts from all of the different places and all of the things. Now, since then, he's also done about 5 different certificates. He's done a number of short courses around different professional organizations or provided by professional organizations, and all of these things he has to manage essentially manually. Okay, so that's context. Let me also give you some institutional warning signs that are motivating some of the work that you're going to see. The first of which is that we have been experiencing transcript requests drop by about 3% a year for the past 4 years. Transcripts, of course, are what the graduate requests when they're seeking a job to demonstrate their skills and capabilities, their bona fides to the employer. And over the last 4 years, we've seen a drop of 12% in those requests. Now, employers' critiques, we've done interviews with employers and such, and the single most common flavor of critique is that the student transcript doesn't say anything about what a student can do. In fact, it's a list of courses, they don't know what they mean, it's got titles, they don't know what they're for, and it has nothing but it has grades, but that doesn't tell them What's the difference between a B and an A in a heat transfer in engineering? The registrar, out of a sense of responsibility, is concerned about that. He is the person at our institution in the U.S. generally responsible for curating all of the students' records. So he has an internal sense of responsibility for the students that he is aggregating their performance measures from. He has an external sense of responsibility in the sense that he is the institution's designee to make reports to the federal government, to the state government, to demonstrate the accountability of the institution and the expenditure of funds towards institutional education. And students are frustrated because they know they need the transcript, or at least many of them believe they need the transcript. And they also know it's not particularly helpful or meaningful to getting any particular job. It's just a step they have to go through, and they have to pay a certain amount of money to do it. Okay. So part of this then of the story is about recognizing achievement. And we've heard a lot about badging. At our institution, most faculty would respond to badging as, oh, that's the thing you get for doing welding, right? It's associated with vocational training. Faculty in general aren't expected, nor do they receive any formal training and assessment. What they receive is formal training in their research discipline. And by the way, they have to teach. And so for many faculty, teaching when they become a faculty member is maybe the first time they've done that. They have done a tremendous amount of research at that point, but it may very well be the first time teaching. And so we have a two-part problem. We have a problem with these faculty members now having to assess students and learning to generate and roll up into a transcript, which has no particular meaning to the outside world. And we have this issue of the students largely going through multiple institutions on average and having to manage all of this material about their learning, which in fact they don't necessarily perceive as helpful, but it is a burden they have to manage and deal with. So these are different problems, but we're going to talk about how they might come together. Now, fortunately, we just saw the presentation from the University of New South Wales about adopting rubrics for measuring work that's been going on in the biomedical field. And we are looking at the same AAC and U value rubric materials ourselves because they have them in places that at least start to correspond to the kind of thinking that we believe the institution's interested in conveying. In fact, when I talked to my boss in the Provost's office, the primary question he asked when I asked him is, so what does he expect students to get when they go through his psychology course? And his answer is they think better. Okay. And he knows what that looks like, and he can tell you, but he certainly can't write it down in any meaningful way. So this value rubric framework has given us at least a wedge into the conversation to raise the topic. So what do you mean by that? And here's the one associated with creative thinking. And you can see at the top left in the upper box there is the sort of highest order for acquiring competencies, the capstone highest order level. Further to the right, bottom right, is the bottom level for just sort of the benchmark of things. And that one's, I'm highlighting the one associated with connecting and synthesizing and transforming. So if you can at least recognize connections and such, that's kind of a level one. And then in that particular column, transforms ideas or solutions into entirely new forms. That's something that expresses your ability to take that and then add value to it from your perspective, experience, and insight. But at least it's a useful framework within which to have these conversations. Badging gives us an opportunity for granularity in that process. Those of you playing badge bingo, I put up the little graphic there so you can mark that box. And it does a lot of useful things, helping us identify learning outcomes, giving some potential autonomy to the learner because the badge potentially moves with the learner, selects and presents what they know because we can use the evidence field, although most haven't taken well advantage of that, and allows us to motivate potentially rewarding learners and maybe in facilitating or enhancing persistence in the programs. And it provides some recognition on the PD side, the professional development side, which can be of value. So our three goals for looking at where we are, I gave you the issue of the institution's relevance in the context of transcripts being diminished so that things are now starting to roll up to a single entity, the actual logo of our institution relative to any other institution is about the method by which employers judge graduates from our institution. So our three goals are, one, to make that transcript more useful and informative, and our registrar is actually very interested in the movement that is popular amongst some, at least, of the registrars through their professional organization, ACRO. It's referred to as extended transcripts, trying to add some richness to that value, that thing. The problem they have is that their typical approach is to add for every single course materials of stuff, which is potentially overwhelming. And so we have to try to put a brake on that. Secondly, to foster discussion on assessing skills and both procedural and higher order. And finally, to give learners the autonomy and agency which we have not given them to date in terms of managing their own learning outcomes. Okay, so fortunately, John was very helpful in presenting blockchain basics, so I don't have to say anything more about that, and I can wipe those slides out and save you that particular gory detail. I will do one thing, however. I will say something about the shortcomings of the existing Bitcoin environment because it is, in fact, one of the reasons why many of us are looking beyond that. So there's issues associated with scalability of this from the terms in the context of the information within a block. Block sizes are fixed, and they are not something that you can stick a lot of information into. This is primarily a currency trading environment, and therefore the cost of a commit is a market-driven number. For about a 15 kilobyte piece of information in a block, at the moment, when I checked before coming here, cost us a little over $1.15 to make that commit into the blockchain. Imagine 52,000 students with hundreds of material, things that you might want to put into a block, and that becomes real money. Thirdly, that environment is really, really effective in the sense of being very simplified and very efficient for what it does. And it does that by having this very specific commands for making changes, to writing things, to committing things, etc. And those opcodes, the so-called operational codes, are not a language. They're a set of commands. So you can't write programs with those things. You can only do what the intention of the Bitcoin environment was intended. That is, move things from one place to another, and that thing is almost always money, or at least it has been. So asset diversity is not something that is a big issue in the Bitcoin world, asset being the money value. They're starting to look at other things to put in there, and that's what's driven this concept. There's also the monocultural risk that everything is encrypted with the same encryption algorithm, so that if it ever gets broken, there's a major issue at hand. Hence, a lot of the current work in blockchain development is associated with having a pluggable encryption option. The Hyperledger project from IBM, for example, is working on an algorithm essentially to allow you to have a family of encryptions, and you choose the one you want for the particular environment that you're in. Because it is so largely distributed and such a uniform thing, it's difficult to innovate in that environment, and there's not much in the way of upgrade paths. That's one of the fights going on in the Bitcoin world today. One of the ways that people have tried to get around this is the notion of something that's referred to as a sidechain. And a sidechain is essentially a separate chain from the main chain, a separate database from the primary database that is somehow separated in the sense that it is isolated from it. It allows, therefore, the ability to move things from one to the other, but not to be dependent on and be protected from problems from one side or from other side chains and problems from the main chain for that matter. So, the value proposition of this is that Bitcoins are essentially dependent on a single asset. The assets, however, in the sidechain environment allow them to be movable across chains. They should be able to move without counterpart risk. That means without dishonest parties interfering or causing problems in that process. The transfers need to be atomic, meaning that when you make a transfer, it either goes or it doesn't. It doesn't go part way. They are firewalling you off from the activities going on around you, which is a helpful attribute, so that they are essentially independent of one another. And you don't have to track what's going on all the other side chains. You just have to pay attention to yours. So it's got a lot of attributes that give you some flexibility. An enhancement of the sidechain is the notion of being able to move things both ways from your side chain to somebody else's main chain and back. And that way you can have materials that you maintain, curate, and are responsible for, put them over into a larger main chain area, which may or may not be public, and have that record permanently in your side of what you had before. So you're not giving it away. You have the record of that, but it's now in the main chain as a permanent record for that environment. So that's extremely important, and that will frame a lot of our thinking going forward. And then finally, there was the sort of unique thing that Nakamoto, the inventor of this whole process, whom we've never figured out yet, it was sort of the key thing was this notion of when you make these commitments, the reason, the rationale, the thing that gives you the opportunity to do that is not anything to do with how much knowledge you have. It's simply your ability computationally to solve a puzzle. And if you can do that, you can make the commit, period. Now that's useful in their context. It's less useful in the context of assets that aren't money. Because it makes sense if you're sending things like money from one place to another, that it might have a cost associated with it. But when you're moving assets like a credential or evidence value associated with a pointer to some other resource outside that environment, that becomes a little bit more difficult to deal with. So, what problem, again, are we trying to solve? We're trying to make university credentials informative to employers. We're trying to introduce transparency and consistency into the learning asset process, the learning assessment process. We're trying to give our agency to learners. That's what we're trying to do. Now, we have to do this in the context of careful mindfulness of our institution. It has to fit, and our solution and approach may not fit yours, and so it's not simply you can take this and say, well, we'll just try it this way. First of all, the registrar's role is a keeper of credentials. So whatever happens in our environment, if they're not on board, this project is over. The faculty's role in this environment is judgment of student learning. And if that is not something that they can see as embodied in the solution that is helping, then it's also not going to gain their support, and it's probably dead in the water. And finally, the student's role, of course, is to be the willingness to be challenged and explore, engage in uncomfortable interactions, and work through desirable difficulties towards some goal. So that's the three-part thing we have to try to balance in this activity. So what are we trying to do that? So we're trying to take advantage of Nate's Badger I/O environment as the framework, as much of anything because it's a nice encapsulation of a reasonably rich metadata set, and 2.0 being, we think, even better than currently available today. So we have a Badger environment running that is actually, in our particular case, embedded in our Canvas learning management system. One of the things we realized as we started this project is that all of our institutions have institutional repositories for faculty work. We do not have an institutional repository for student work. And it's sort of one of those kind of, huh? When you say it out loud, why is that? But we've never had that. Our library has jumped to the fore and said we should. And so as part of this process, we're building in the evidence associated with the badge, being work that will be put over into our University of Texas Library long-term preservation space, which happens in our case to be DSpace. And that will probably morph to Fedora and Spotlight shortly, but right now it's DSpace. So when information gets in the badge is looked at, it's being, and the evidence URL is being worked on, it will be moved, that evidence will be moved as a pointer into our Texas DSpace instance, and it will return back a DOI, which will go back into the evidence field. And with 2.0, there'll be more granularity of the types of evidence that we can separate instead of just a bit bucket full of things. So so we get that, that's the step 3. Then we run a DAP, a distributed application, which goes through the metadata of the badge environment and then begins to do the transfer of that into our particular flavor of blockchain, and that happens to be our Ethereum environment. And so I have, John's graphics are much nicer. I have that little orange thing there that represents the blocks on our blockchain for our local environment. So that's sort of the model that we're having in this. Again, it's keeping the issue of all of this back-end stuff away from faculty. They're focusing on the rubric assessment and the value assessment associated with how do we judge work. The registrar is looking at what's going to be drawn from the DSpace repository to potentially provide a URL to the transcript to try to add value to that, and we will discuss with him or her how to put, in fact, the student in the middle of that chain. Haven't had that conversation yet, but that's where it's headed. And that's the beginning of this. But that's not nearly sufficient. In fact, the whole point of the blockchain environment is that this is a distributed database. There's multiple replicates that you need, and the more replicates you have, the more secure and safer it is. So in order to, at least at the moment, simulate that, we've created a series of Ethereum chains. The College of Engineering is running one, the library is running one, the IT organization on our campus is running one, et cetera, to model what this process would look like. Again, recognizing that our campus is very conservative and actually having it run elsewhere at the moment would be a step too far for them to feel comfortable with. But the intention here is to partner with a number of universities. We've already had extensive conversations with Stanford as a first partner with us on this, and replicate this environment, at least conceptually. They may choose a number of different steps or elements along the way. But let's just say generically in this case. So we have our institution as University 1, some other institution as University 2. Their badge chain environment may be Bletchley running under the Azure framework. They have a different LMS perhaps. They're probably not going to use Texas repositories, but they're going to have a repository of some sort of their own, et cetera. And the evidence in this case is not only going to live in the repository, what will be published in the same fashion of the blockchain will be published in a distributed file system, in this case IPFS, so that the student's work is now distributed elsewhere as well. One of the goals is to make sure that the student's work is widely distributed and that it's the student that has the primary associated responsibility for access and disseminating it. Okay. And eventually, this needs to then have so this is the notion of various side chains at different institutions. Eventually, this needs to have some sort of a larger chain that is the main chain, and whether that's a permission chain or a public chain remains a question. I suspect for us, given the conservativeness that we have, we will want to pick a handful of institutions that we feel are our peers, for example, and convince them that they should run a chain, and that way we would trust them as the miners in this world to make commits to that chain, because we have an out-of-bound trust relationship already established, and we don't have to leverage the capability that the blockchain affords, which has an algorithm for ensuring that trust is implemented, but it's there nonetheless. If we can go beyond that and make it a public chain for the camp, for the university, for the collection of universities, and then ultimately for the country, that's another possibility. But I'm conservative, and I think I will use John's attempts to get a national blockchain going in the UK to push us, but I'm not sure how far that'll get. So this is cool stuff again, but just I want to remind you of the problem. We have learning that has evidence associated with it. We have rubrics and assessment that are being applied to that learning that in our case typically go to grades. Those things end up translated into courses and course credit, which go onto a transcript. We have on the bottom side there learning and outcomes, which has evidence. That's cool. And we have assessments and a rubric to do it. That's cool. Now this is all on a layered environment. We've now added some things like the badging environment. And we have learning assertions, which we can aggregate in the badge. Then we can do something else. We can make the wallet available for the interim to have a mechanism of placing it someplace, and we can begin this notion of transparently putting it into a permanent distributed database environment. And in fact, what's interesting about all of this is that the first half of that, the part I've X'd out there, is common in whether you're talking about the current institutional pattern or not. It's the second part that is where we start to differentiate, where we're starting to move. This is a transcript. Tell me how informative that is. I mean, really? That's it. So, We're trying to make credentials more informative to employers. We're trying to give agency to learners. We're trying to reassert the autonomy and independence from the institution or the corporate as an intermediary in maintaining learning and provide a solution that has a potential to be lifelong for our learners. That's the story I wanted to tell. We are at this point, we have our several Ethereum blockchains running. We've got our little dApp that's being able to read the Badger IO metadata and write it into that. We have nothing in the way of a useful UI for the students to be able to manage anything yet. There's all kinds of issues associated, and we've just started the conversations with our faculty on the value rubric, but we're approaching that in two interesting ways. One is badges are really good for procedural skill certification or acknowledgement, and we have a very expansive interest on our campus for the building and availability of maker spaces for our students. And so come this fall, we will have 24,000 square feet of new maker spaces on campus. And those are going to be used and embedded with the curriculum in the engineering program. So students in engineering have to do build projects from their first year on and progressively through their course there. If you're going to use a makerspace, you have to get certified for safety of the equipment involved. And so we're in the process of developing a badging certification for the use and access of the equipment in the makerspaces, so that you'll have a single, associated with your ID card, a single set of credentials that allow you to use the equipment that you're credentialed for at any of the makerspaces on campus. And we've begun talking to Tech Square in town because they have makerspaces in major cities, one of which is at ours, and we'd like them to be able to accept the badge certifications for that space as well. So a student can move to their location and use their equipment, and then go to another city for that matter and use that equipment with minimal friction to be able to have to demonstrate once again that they can safely operate a 3D printer or a lathe or whatever it happens to be. So we have that procedural level. And then we have at the university 2 courses in engineering, both capstone courses on mechanical engineering design that are the typical engineering design capstone course, right? Where you're told that you have a project that's too big for you, a budget that's too small for you, a set of goals and objectives that are grandiose, and a time too short to build anything, and you have to deliver an alpha prototype in the end of the semester. And that's the process that a typical mechanical engineering capstone program consists of. And so we are doing the value rubric for that to be able to put as a thing for the badge. If we can demonstrate we can do it there, then we think we can open up the boundaries associated with the rest of the institution. But it's our first entry into that. So that's our approach. And we have a team of people that have been involved, and I'd like to give them special thanks for their participation in this, because we couldn't do it without them, and particularly the faculty in engineering that are collaborating with us. Thank you.
Questions for Phil?
Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting things you're doing with the blockchain. I was wondering, what is your opinion on the fact if something like a badge chain should be a totally public blockchain or a consortium blockchain? Because the concerns you are expressing would indicate...
Right. So the issue is how much is actually exposed as part of whatever's in the public chain. And we will take a relatively conservative, well, 2 things about that. We will work with our students to determine what they feel is a reasonable amount of exposure to make in a public context. I suspect they'll be more generous than most of our faculty would. And we'll try to use that as a guideline. But I suspect that they will want to have public the courses and at least some indication or a piece of evidence about their work in a course, because it's the biggest missing piece they've had so far in a public sense. Then they're going to want to be able to have the granularity in terms of security access to be able to hand to a prospective graduate school or employment agency or employer a very directed set of resources that particularly highlight things that they believe that employer or that graduate school are going to be interested in, and see much more detail around that. And indeed, we're thinking that that something like Spotlight, I don't know if you're familiar with Spotlight. Spotlight is a an asset curation system for library materials. It actually essentially is a portfolio system that any individual can quickly learn and select assets from a repository in a library and make a website to put a narrative around that. We're thinking that that's probably the UI to draw for the presentation of stuff from the blockchain, because it can go with them as well.
Phil, thank you so much for your presentation. It's actually super encouraging to see the work that you're doing in Austin.
Where are you?
I'm here,
there,
Layla. As well as Patsy in Australia, Tanya in Canada. One question for you, but also applies to the other representatives from the universities. Have you had any conversations at the university level about accepting badges on the college applications and financial aid applications from the high school students? So some of the populations that we at LRNG are serving, just to ensure that you're getting a very diverse population into the university.
So the answer is we've had some conversations. We have a number of what we refer to as bridge programs. One is called on-ramps, for example, which are dual credit in the U.S. language, which means a student in high school is going through a program. It has 2 levels of work, effectively. If they're competent and capable, they can perform the work that's associated with their high school requirements and the work that's associated with a college credit. And when they graduate, then that they have the college credit for that particular discipline along with their high school. And those are badged at the moment. But it is not badged in the way of a formal method of submitting that badge as an application. And that's because, remember the governance layers I was talking about in Texas, that's a conversation that has to include at least 4 different political bodies. And it is not a conversation I'm looking forward to, but I know it's one that we have to have. So at least we have a demonstrated potential for 2 or 3 programs, which are these bridge programs that are currently badging today.
So my question was really about adoption, getting started, and overcoming the resistance, and what kind of resistance you got, and what kind of messaging did it take to get people to get unhooked from their old ideas and adopt this?
So I'd say that the least success so far has been with the faculty, not surprisingly. We have, the best thing I can say is that we have willingness from a number of senior mechanical engineering full professors who find it amusing enough to want to consider. And so they're humoring us and playing along with us at the moment. They are, in fact, I think, recognizing the pushback that we're giving them, saying, okay, you say you can recognize this quality work associated with this capability as an engineering principle or phenomenon. How do you go about making that determination and keeping the conversation going to extract out of them the elements so that we can start to put that into some sort of framework that they can say, yeah, that looks right. The other thing we're doing is talking to professional associations associated with mechanical engineering and with ABET, the society in the U.S. that accredits engineering programs. ABET's very interested because they would like to see a much more rigorous, much more objectively defined set of outcomes for students in the engineering programs that are getting a degree. And the professional society seems interested as well. So if we can leverage the industry on this particular point, I think we'll make some progress. Interestingly, the institution side, there's deep commitment because they recognize that the system that they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis to manage student records is in fact in trouble. And that is a big push. So if we didn't have Shelby Stanford, our registrar, and for that matter, Tom Black, the registrar at Stanford, who are both senior members in the national organization and in the research parts of those organizations, we wouldn't be as far as we are, but we're fortunate in having those collaborations. Okay. Always a question in the back.
And Don.
And it's Don.
Thanks, Bill. That's fascinating. My question has to do with, I have, I guess, some reservations about blockchains. Mm-hmm. And my question is, you seem to be doing it all at once, badges and blockchains.
Yes.
And can you talk through the strategy of why you chose to do both at once versus one and then adding the blockchains later?
Sure, because that one's an easy one. From our perspective, the front-end side of this issue is what the badging environment and Badger.io has been really good at, which is presenting a mechanism for identifying the metadata that's set that really should be representing student work. We don't want to associate that with a course. We want to associate that with major integrative points in a course. So we're expecting no more than a couple, maybe 3 kind of badges out of a given course. We don't want to have a one-to-one relationship between those two at all. But so from our perspective, the badging system and the badging development of metadata is a tremendously useful guide, because you need all the blockchain is doing is giving you a transparent place to put stuff without reasonable content that's driven by a solution that meets the needs of our institution, which is coming from that metadata of the badge environment. There would be no reason to do the blockchain at all, because it would be valueless in that sense. Now, how long the badging environment will persist as it is, I don't know. I suspect for quite some time. But from our view, it's an easier thing to represent. It's an easier conversation to have, to begin to talk about assessing a student's work with evidence behind it that points to various things that are tangible associated with it. That was what you get when you think about a badge. And that you can actually put someplace. I mean, I have mixed feelings about actually whether the image of the badge, the picture, has been a hindrance or a help in this place. Because I look at it from the point of view of the package of data. And that's what's important. I don't care what it looks like. Now, that's me, because I'm a data person. So that's why we're trying to do these in parallel. One without the other wouldn't make any sense. It would make more sense to do just the badging, but then we end up with all the data in a database sitting someplace, and we get nothing that values the student's agency over time to potentially manage that, because it'd just be that institution. We might be able to convince other people to put their stuff into that database using the same system and all of that, but that's a much harder sell, I think, than it is to have a common technological infrastructure that everybody can put their stuff in.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. I will have to adapt to my French accent. I know it can be difficult on the third day of the conference and after the party we had yesterday, but bear with me. What I would like to do during these few minutes that precede the roundtable we would like to have afterwards is to explain why do we have this conference and why we created this conference. And my interest in technologies for learning, I don't like much the term of educational technologies, I like the term using technology for learning, is that there are 2 types of technology, okay, more than 2 types, but there is on the one hand the technology that can be used to pull things out of people, like a magic wand that would tell me who you are. And there are other technologies, instructional technologies, that are about how can I put things into the right shape that it will enter into the head of the people. And I've seen many, many things about instructional technology, which is about these things, how to shape things for people to consume them. I'm much more interested on the other part of the technology. So I would like to give you a case study I use again and again, excuse me for those that have already mentioned it too, and this is connected to the first day of the conference and probably what follows, is you have migrants arriving in your country and you would like to, they don't speak the language and you want to teach them the local language. what do you do? When I see an instructional designer, a teacher, an advanced one, who thinks about open educational resources, will say, oh, I have good learning resources. On top of that, it is open. And these resources will teach him or her English. My take on that is to say, tell me your story in your own language. It is a process when you encounter that person starts by recognizing that person. That's why it's called unconditional recognition. And the difference between the two is, in the first one approach is, you see the deficit, so you have a solution to fix the deficit. And the other one is, I want to know you. It is a more humanistic approach. It is about recognition. And the idea of recognition, in French you can play with words. In French you can say reconnaissance. Reconnaissance, in French there is a re, okay, like a repeat, ends again. But connaissance, it's like we are co-born, we are born together. That is, at the moment where we meet each other, we are born together. So the recognition process is a very symmetrical process. It is building a relationship. It's not a transaction. It is a relationship. And I think the concept of recognition is very important. And I think I need my glasses. And the concept of yeah, it works. Thank you very much. Yes, it's cool. I love that quote from Rabbi Mendel of Cox. He says, if I am I simply because I am I, and thou art thou simply because thou art thou, then am I and thou art thou. But if I am you, but if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I'm not I and you are not you. And I think this idea of intertwined identities, you can't, there is often a mistake in the field of technology, in IT, where we make the mistake between identifiers and identity. And our identity is something which is distributed in all of us. And I would like to give another quote from Ronald Lang, who says, every relationship implies a definition of self by others and other by self. A person's own identity can never be completely abstracted from his identity for others. When we think about that, this is what we live every day. What kind of technology have we developed in order to emulate that or represent that? The technologies we have developed tend to create ourselves as silos, even they limit ourselves to an identifier. And I think an identity can be reduced to an identifier, not even to a series of identifiers, but an identity is about relationships. And so if we have this idea that our identity is spread into others, this was an idea advanced in Roma when Simone gently invited me to speak about open badges. And the idea was, can we think about holographic identities? And if we think about badges, that could be a means to create these holographic identities, because our identities are co-constructed, they are resilient. When you think about an hologram is very resilient, because when you have a holopixel that disappears, you can recreate the image from all the remaining holopixels. And that's probably, that could be a way to think about the blockchain as being some kind of a hologram. It's trustworthy, it's distributed, it is connected. It is complex yet uncomplicated. We often make the mistake between complicated and complex. And often by creating some technologies that are a bit complicated, we reduce the complexity we can express with technology. So my take on badges is, if we think about our identities as holographic identities, maybe the badges that are relationships could be the pixels of our holographic identity. So the question is, what technology to construct our identities, to have our intertwined narratives? We say often that ePortfolio is the voice of the learner, and I've seen many portfolios where it was more the voice of the ventriloquist. It is maybe the voice of the learner, but it is the teacher we're speaking because it's creating the conditions. And if a portfolio is graded, I remember last year in Barcelona, one of the presenters explained that she had to grade the portfolio because if the portfolio was not graded, the students wouldn't do their portfolio. So where is the authentic voice of the learner? And something I mentioned yesterday, we say ePortfolio is about reflective learning. Even if we stay within the small domain of reflective writing, we still don't have a semantic editor to write our reflections. We still have a simple text, and semantic editors are being used by scientists. Why don't we provide science technology to people who are writing their portfolio? So there is a discrepancy between what we claim we want to do and the technologies we have really developed. And then there is this idea of a badge being something being learner-centric. And we should be very careful when we speak about centricity, because this is very centric. This is centric on the user. And I think we can think about, if we think about badges as a mean to create this narrative, these identities, these connected identities, I'm afraid that what we have with badges now are in the conformance quarter of this picture. We are in the traditional, representing the past, static documents, and it is centered on the institution. This is where we are. And there is no reason we can't move to other quarters. We could have dream badges. This is what I want to be. These are the values I want to defend. I can create my own badges. They can change over time. They can be dynamic. So when we think about badges as signs of recognition, then let's move out of the quadrant of micro credentials. So one thing which is discussed often is the idea of sovereign identities. To have a sovereign identity, we need to be able to define it ourselves. And it starts with defining our own identifiers. And the technology to make it happen exists, and it is not rocket science at all. Basically, what you need to start to have a sovereign identity, you need to be able to have what we call a key pair. You need to have a private and a public key, which allows what we call asymmetric encryption. So basically, everything encrypted with a private key can be deciphered with a public key. Everything encrypted with a public key can be deciphered by the private key. So for example, if you want to send me a badge, and I want that badge to be private, you encrypt that badge with my public key, and nobody else but me will be able to read that badge. So the technology exists, it is used in blockchains, but it has not been democratized to make it, to provide everybody with this kind of technology. So, and with this kind of technology, not only we would be able to endorse badges, but we would be able to endorse anything. So I would like to tell you a short story, which is the story of Cloney Brown. Who knows Cloney Brown? Okay, yes, it's a bit old. But you can imagine what it could be. So Cloney Brown wants to be a plumber. And Cloney Brown has a website. She creates a website of I am a plumber. And someone comes to the website, maybe a client of Cloney Brown, and says, oh, I think you're a wonderful plumber. I would like to endorse you as a plumber. So what do you have to do for that, to endorse Cloney Brown as a plumber? Well, basically, you take an identified piece of information from the website. That could be the URL, for example, and then you encrypt the URL. And then sorry, there was a mistake here. So someone should have noticed it. You encrypt not with your public key, but you encrypt it with your private key. It was to check if you were paying attention. So if I So if I encrypt it with my private key, if it is encrypted with the private key of the person who wants to endorse, and then you add your public key, then what you have is an endorsement which is verifiable. It is as simple as that. You can endorse a website. You could also endorse the badge. And so it looks like that in reality. You have strange characters, suites of characters, which is the encrypted message, another one which is a public key. In fact, to be efficient, you don't encrypt the whole thing. You create what we call a digest, but that's secondary. That's engineering stuff. We can assume that we encrypt something. And with that, the question is, who has signed it? Who is the endorser? Do you know the endorser? It's Ernst Lubitsch. Ernst Lubitsch made the movie Cloney Brown. And so you can have exactly the same process to be sure that it is Ernst Lubitsch who has endorsed. Of course, Ernst Lubitsch was dead in 1947, something like that, so probably he's not in... he couldn't endorse something today. You could have doubts about it. But this technology of endorsement is quite easy if you think about it. There are some dangers, some problems with the fact you could lose your private key. But that's things that can be solved. There are a number of solutions around that. So what I would really like to be able to do is to give people the right to trust, and that was why with Nate we went to the Open Ed conference in Washington with a paper which was about everybody has a right to issue and receive badges, not just to receive badges. And so now the idea is everybody should have the right to endorse, everybody should have the right to sign their name identifiers. And basically, everybody should have the right to write their name on the internet, on a document. And if you give people the right to write, I think that would change many things. Because you give a tool for people to act. As I wrote in my blog post, to move from the power to pack to the power to act. And so if you think about today when you send a CV, a resume, or even when you show your backpack or your passport, the only thing you can see is the endorsement you have received, your accreditation, your diploma. But what you don't see is just the top of the iceberg. But what about all the endorsements you have given to others? You want to make them visible, and probably they are even more important. They tell more about you than the credentials you have received. And so if you want to have the holistic picture of the individual, you need to be able to see the endorsement received, what is about me, and what is by me. So that was what I wanted to share with you as ideas today. Thank you.
Are there questions for Serge in this process? Well, I have one for you, though. Can't get away. And that is, this is in some sense, I believe, the structure that you've talked about before with respect to aspirational badges, if you will. Statements about what you would like to learn or achieve that might have steps along the way that can be endorsed by anybody that has the capability to recognize and perhaps give you affirmation that that has been achieved or something of that sort. And similarly, gives you the opportunity to be the endorser of these aspirational goals. Do you see that as taking on a life of its own, or just a part of an enriched environment of authentic presence on the web?
I think it could take a life of its own, and it could be. This was a discussion we had yesterday during the dinner. Was we could also imagine blockchains based around one badge, each badge having its own blockchain, and then if you endorse my badge, then we are part of the same chain. So so the information is distributed and connects us. So instead of having one centralized or multiple centralized, we could have each piece of data being replicated where it is being shared with. So and then it could have a life of its own. So to have something which grows organically.
Anybody else have a question?
And then we move to the round table.
Thank you for this presentation, Serge. One question is really related to this concept of endorsement that we're seeing on LinkedIn. And it doesn't necessarily mean as much as they intended. So I'd love to get your perspective on like what you see are the main differences between the concept that you're proposing and what already exists. And then at what point in this in the timeline endorsement is critical? Is it after the badge is issued and the person is on the job, is applying those skills, that the endorsement from the beneficiary of that service is valuable? So again, the difference between what already exists as endorsement, and then at what point you think would be most valuable?
The endorsement in LinkedIn is first within a straitjacket, and then it is a bit of a comedy. It is just a gimmick to create artificially links between individuals. I've received endorsements, and I think it's the case for most of us here, for things I've never done in my life. And the problem, you can endorse something for someone and have no consequences. If we develop this kind of general purpose endorsement technology, then we can create services that will be able to make some network analysis, be able to identify singularities, some kind of cross, some kind of clubs emerging. And the beauty of that also is, as we have a timestamp, we're able to have an history of these endorsements. So a person who endorses that just arrives within the web will have very, very low value. But if it is someone who has been on the web and doing endorsement for 10 years, then and these endorsements have been probably endorsed as well. Maybe the endorser has been endorsed by a university or by an association, then the endorsement could have much more value. So the endorsement is context dependent. It's not an absolute value of the endorsement. It is how, in which context, maybe the value of the endorsement would be very local. It could be within a city. It could be within a group of an association, and not meaningful beyond that.
One last quick question.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's not very easy to speak around people who are very knowledgeable about open badges, but my question is, you said that everybody has right to issue and receive badges, which will maybe, I don't know, I'm very new, maybe that might create a badge inflation, I don't know, in the future. So these endorsements, do you think, can become a kind of an accreditation one day? So,
But if we do, there was this issue. I remember the beginning, because I have a background in competency-based education. I thought that badges should be only for some things very serious, should be just about competencies. And then when I realized that badges were trust relationships, I rephrased the question you just asked. Is it a problem if we have too many trust relationships? So, I think the community will be able to contribute to the accreditation, to the recognition. So it is something that has to grow organically. We try to build something where there is not just an authority or a series of authority, but we are our own authority. We are our own identity provider. And then there are dynamics, and they have to. There will be some bizarre things that might happen, certainly, but that's life. We want to have life coming into badges, so we don't want things that have been stifled. I'm tired. Okay. Dominique.
Serge, are you going to provide an introduction? Are you going to provide an introduction of what we're... Okay. Let me get plugged in. So